The champagne glass trembled in my hand as the words cut through the reception hall like a blade through silk. "Don't mind her, she's just army trash." My father's voice carried across the polished marble floor, past the crystal chandeliers, over the perfectly arranged white roses. Every conversation stopped. Every fork paused midway to someone's mouth. Even the string quartet faltered, their violins hanging silent in the sudden vacuum of sound. I stood there in my dress blues, metals gleaming under the soft lighting, still wearing the white gloves I'd chosen for this moment. This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Instead, it felt like standing at attention while someone emptied a clip into everything I'd ever worked for. The heat crawled up my neck like fingers made of flame, but I didn't move. I couldn't move. Because moving would mean acknowledging what had just happened, and I wasn't ready for that kind of reckoning. Some guests chuckled nervously, the way people do when they witness something so uncomfortable they don't know whether to pretend they didn't hear it or disappear entirely. Others stared down at their plates as if the salmon had suddenly become the most fascinating thing in the room. But everyone heard it. Every single person in that hall now knew exactly what Colonel Thomas Blackwell thought of his daughter on her wedding day. Then David stood up. My husband of exactly 3 hours rose from his chair with the kind of calm that comes from years of training, years of discipline, years of knowing exactly when to speak and when to stay silent. He lifted his own champagne glass, cleared his throat just once, and looked directly at my father with eyes that could have melted steel. "Sir," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "that trash is my commanding officer." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of silence that has its own gravity, pulling everything in the room toward a single point of truth that no one could ignore. My father's face went from smug satisfaction to complete shock in the space of a heartbeat. The wine in his mouth sprayed across his pristine dress shirt in a crimson arc that stained the white fabric like spilled blood on snow. Nobody laughed this time. But before I tell you how that moment changed everything, before I explain why my father's words hit like they did, and why David's response shattered something that had been building for decades, I need to take you back. Back to a house where silence was louder than screaming, where approval was rationed like ammunition, and where I learned that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who hurt you the deepest. My father was a soldier before he was anything else. Colonel Thomas Blackwell, 3 combat tours, 2 Bronze Stars, and 1 unshakable belief that had shaped every decision he'd ever made about me. Daughters weren't soldiers. They were liabilities dressed up in uniforms they hadn't earned, playing at war games they'd never understand. He'd shake hands with complete strangers if they wore the right patches, but he never once asked me how my day went, never once said he was proud, never once looked at me like I was anything more than a disappointment in boots. The house I grew up in felt more like a barracks than a home. Breakfast at 0600 sharp, shoes arranged at perfect 90-degree angles by the door, television off by 1900 because real soldiers didn't waste time on entertainment. Every surface was polished to military specification. Every corner was squared away with the precision of a man who believed that order could compensate for the absence of warmth. My mother tried to soften the edges. She was a literature teacher with gentle hands and a voice like honey over warm bread, always tucking poems into my lunch bag and whispering that strength didn't always have to announce itself. She taught me that some battles were won by standing still instead of charging forward, that sometimes the quietest person in the room was also the strongest. But when she died from cancer when I was 13, the house went completely silent. Not just quiet, but hollow, like the echo of footsteps in an empty cathedral. After that, it was just me and him and the weight of expectations I could never meet. He didn't raise a daughter. He tried to train a subordinate who happened to share his last name. The difference was that subordinates could eventually earn respect through performance, but I was trapped in a category he'd created where success was impossible by definition. I could be perfect, and it would never be enough because perfect daughters weren't soldiers, and soldiers weren't daughters. I learned to navigate that contradiction by becoming invisible. I pressed his uniforms with edges sharp enough to cut paper. I memorized regulations like other kids memorized song lyrics. I could recite the Army values backward and forward, knew the layout of every major military installation in the country, and understood the chain of command better than some junior officers. But none of that mattered because I was still just the girl in his eyes. When I told him I wanted to apply to West Point, he didn't yell. Yelling would have meant he took the idea seriously enough to argue against it. Instead, he laughed. Not a real laugh, but a short bark of dismissal that said everything about what he thought of my chances. Then he stood up, walked out of the room, and left his dinner half finished on the plate. That was our dynamic in miniature. I would reach for something, and he would turn away before I could touch it. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. I left it on the kitchen counter next to his coffee mug, positioned so he couldn't miss it when he came down for his morning ritual. He picked it up, read the first line, folded it neatly in half, and slid it back across the counter without a word. No congratulations. No questions about when I would leave or what I planned to study. No acknowledgement that his daughter had just achieved something that 98% of applicants never would. 3 months later, he drove me to the bus station. Not to West Point itself, just to the Greyhound depot where I would begin the journey that would take me away from his house forever. He pulled my duffel bag from the trunk, set it down on the cracked asphalt, and handed me a manila envelope without making eye contact. Inside was a check for $500 and a typed note that said, "You'll need boots. Don't embarrass yourself." No signature, no goodbye, no acknowledgement that this might be the last time we saw each other for years. I watched his truck disappear into traffic and realized something that would shape every decision I made from that moment forward. I was never going to win his approval by trying harder or being better or proving myself worthy of his attention. The only way to win was to stop playing his game entirely, to build something so undeniably solid that it didn't matter whether he saluted it or not. That's exactly what I did. For the next 15 years, I earned every stripe, every promotion, every deployment, and every commendation, without once looking over my shoulder to see if he was watching. I led convoys through hostile territory, coordinated humanitarian missions in conditions that would break most people, and saved lives in ways that never made headlines, but always mattered to the soldiers who went home to their families because of decisions I made in moments when there was no room for error. I rose through the ranks quietly, steadily, like water finding its way through stone. Not because I was trying to prove anything to him anymore, but because I was trying to prove something to myself, that I could be exactly who I was meant to be, with or without his blessing. And then I met David Monroe, and everything changed again. David appeared in my life like sunrise after the longest night. No fanfare, no dramatic entrance, just a quiet competence that drew respect without demanding it. He walked into the briefing room at Fort Carson with rolled sleeves and a tablet under his arm, completely unbothered by the fact that he was about to sit through another logistics presentation that would put most intelligence officers to sleep. I was delivering a debrief on supply chain vulnerabilities in hostile environments, standard stuff, maps, charts, risk assessments that looked boring on paper but meant the difference between soldiers coming home or coming home in boxes. Most of the intel guys tuned out the moment I started talking about convoy protocols. David didn't. He leaned forward, took notes, asked the kind of questions that showed he'd actually read the entire brief twice. When the meeting ended, he waited until the room cleared before approaching my desk. No posturing, no attempt to impress me with his credentials or his war stories. He simply pointed to a section of my route analysis and said, "If you shift Echo route about 2 miles west, you'll avoid that exposed valley near Checkpoint 7. Better terrain, fewer sightlines for potential threats." He was right, completely right, and he'd delivered the suggestion without making it sound like a correction or a challenge to my authority. Just one professional offering insight to another. I looked up at him and said, "You intel guys always this helpful?" He grinned and replied, "Only with officers who know what they're doing." That was our beginning. Not romance, not chemistry, just mutual respect between two people who understood that good decisions kept people alive and ego got people killed. We ended up deployed together 6 months later. Syria, Joint Task Force, the kind of operation where everything that could go wrong usually did. The threat environment was fluid, unpredictable, constantly shifting like sand in a windstorm. We lost 2 vehicles to improvised explosives in the first 3 weeks, and everyone was on edge, jumping at shadows and second-guessing every movement order. David didn't have to be in the field for most of his intelligence work, but he showed up anyway. Every patrol briefing, every after-action review, every coordination meeting with local forces. He had this way of being present without taking up space, of contributing without grandstanding. When things went sideways, which they did regularly, he was the voice of calm in the radio chatter, providing real-time analysis that kept us ahead of the curve. One afternoon during a particularly tense handoff with Iraqi security forces, everything almost fell apart. The interpreter got spooked by something, started backing away from the meeting point, and suddenly everyone's hands were drifting toward their weapons. The kind of moment where one wrong move, one misunderstood gesture, could turn a routine coordination into a firefight that nobody wanted. I stepped forward, kept my voice level, my movements slow and deliberate, talked them through it, explained what we were doing and why, waited for the tension to drain out of the situation like air from a punctured tire. When it was over, when handshakes replaced suspicious stares and the convoy could finally move forward, David pulled me aside. "You don't rattle, do you?" he said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite admiration but wasn't far from it either. "Not when it counts," I replied, because that was the truth. I'd learned a long time ago that falling apart was a luxury I couldn't afford. Not in uniform, not in command, not when other people's lives hung in the balance of my decisions. We didn't start dating until months after the deployment ended, after the paperwork was filed and the sand had finally stopped grinding its way out of our gear. Military relationships were complicated enough without adding the stress of overlapping chains of command. But once we were both stateside, once the professional boundaries were clear and clean, something shifted between us. He was gentle without being soft, respectful without being deferential. He never treated my rank like something fragile that needed to be handled with care, never tried to diminish it or work around it or pretend it didn't matter. He understood what those bars on my collar represented because he'd earned his own through the same crucible of training, deployment, and responsibility that had forged mine. Most of the men I'd dated before David had one of 2 reactions to my career. Either they were intimidated by it and tried to make me feel guilty for being successful, or they fetishized it and treated me like some kind of exotic warrior princess instead of a human being. David did neither. He simply met me where I was, as I was, without trying to change me or fix me or soften the edges that other people found too sharp. When he proposed, it wasn't a grand gesture designed for social media. We were walking through Arlington National Cemetery after attending the funeral of a fellow officer, surrounded by white headstones that stretched toward the horizon like an endless formation of the fallen. He stopped beside a bench, pulled out a simple ring and said, "I know you don't need anyone, but I'd like the chance to serve beside you in whatever comes next." I didn't cry. Crying wasn't part of my vocabulary. Hadn't been since I learned that tears were viewed as weakness in a world where weakness could get people killed. But I smiled, took the ring and said, "Then let's start the next mission together." Planning the wedding was easier than either of us had expected. Military ceremony, small guest list, dress uniforms instead of civilian formal wear. No bridesmaids, no groomsmen, no elaborate reception that would cost more than most soldiers made in a year. Just clean, simple, honest. The kind of celebration that honored what we were building together without turning it into a performance for other people. I debated whether to invite my father at all. 15 years of silence had created a gulf between us that seemed too wide to bridge with a simple invitation. But there was still some stubborn corner of my heart that hoped he might show up, might sit quietly in the back row and watch his daughter marry a good man, without turning it into another opportunity to remind me why I wasn't good enough. So I sent the invitation. Formal, military style, with all the proper protocol and ceremony details. 3 weeks later, I received a response card in the mail with a single box checked. Will attend. No personal note, no congratulations, no indication of whether he was coming out of duty or genuine interest in my happiness. The morning of the wedding, I stood in front of my quarters mirror and adjusted the collar of my dress blue uniform. White gloves, polished brass, 4 rows of ribbons that represented deployments and commendations and moments when I'd proven myself worthy of the trust that others had placed in me. My hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, severe and uncompromising. No veil, no flowers, no concessions to traditional bridal expectations. As I slipped into my dress shoes, I thought about every woman who'd been told she wasn't soldier enough, officer enough, leader enough to wear the uniform with authority. I thought about my mother, who'd believed in my strength even when I couldn't see it myself. And I thought about David, waiting for me at the altar not to save me or complete me, but to stand beside me as an equal partner in whatever battles lay ahead. The ceremony itself was everything we'd hoped for: clean, precise, meaningful, without being sentimental. When David slipped the ring onto my finger, his hands were steady, his voice clear. When I repeated my vows, I meant every word. Not just the promise to love and honor him, but the commitment to build something together that neither of us could create alone. After the chapel service, we moved to the reception hall at the Officers' Club. Nothing elaborate, just good food and better company. The guest list was mostly military, people who understood that service meant something deeper than just wearing a uniform. Men and women who'd bled together, who'd carried each other home, who'd learned that loyalty wasn't just a word in a manual but a living commitment that shaped every decision. I was halfway through my second glass of champagne, talking with a group of fellow officers about an upcoming training exercise, when I saw him. My father standing near the bar in his dress uniform, surrounded by a cluster of older veterans who hung on his every word like he was dispensing tactical wisdom from the mountaintop. He hadn't approached me during the ceremony, hadn't congratulated me or David, hadn't acknowledged the significance of the moment in any way. He'd simply taken his seat, watched the proceedings with the same expression he wore during equipment inspections, and then moved to the reception without a word. As I watched him hold court near the bar, regaling his audience with stories about the good old days when soldiers were soldiers and the military knew its place in the world, I felt that familiar knot forming in my stomach. The same tension I'd carried as a child, waiting for him to notice me, to acknowledge me, to give me some sign that I mattered in his carefully ordered universe. That's when I heard him say it. The words hit me like shrapnel from an explosion I should have seen coming. I'd been so focused on celebrating what I'd built with David, so caught up in the rare moment of happiness, that I'd forgotten the cardinal rule of dealing with my father. Never let your guard down. Never assume he's changed. Never hope for anything different than what he's always given you. I turned slowly, my champagne glass still trembling in my white-gloved hand. There he was, Colonel Thomas Blackwell in all his polished glory, chest puffed out like a peacock displaying his plumage for the admiring circle of old-timers who still treated him like some kind of military prophet. His dress uniform was immaculate, every ribbon perfectly aligned, every crease sharp enough to draw blood. He looked exactly like what he'd always been. A man who confused authority with wisdom, tradition with truth. The veterans around him were nodding and chuckling, the way men do when they're trying to stay in the good graces of someone they perceive as their superior. They'd probably served under him at some point, or knew someone who had, and they were still playing the game of deference that military hierarchy demands. But they weren't laughing because what he'd said was funny. They were laughing because silence felt dangerous. One of them, a graying sergeant major with a prosthetic leg, glanced in my direction and his smile faltered. He'd seen my ribbons when I walked past earlier, had probably done the math on what they represented. Combat deployments, humanitarian missions, leadership under fire. the kind of credentials that commanded respect in any room where people understood what they meant. But my father's voice was louder than facts, more compelling than evidence. David was still standing behind me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, the tension coiling in his muscles like a spring under pressure. He'd heard every word, processed the insult in the same tactical way he analyzed intelligence reports, quickly, thoroughly, with an eye toward appropriate response. I could sense him calculating, weighing options, preparing for action. The room had gone quiet in that specific way that happens when something terrible has been said in public and everyone's trying to decide whether they heard it correctly. Conversations didn't stop all at once. They died in waves, spreading outward from the epicenter of my father's voice like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. The string quartet kept playing for a few more measures before the violinist noticed the change in atmosphere and let her bow drift away from the strings. A young lieutenant at a nearby table looked from my father to me and back again, his face flushed with second-hand embarrassment. He was probably trying to reconcile what he'd just heard with what he could see. The woman in dress blues with 4 rows of ribbons, the obvious respect she commanded from everyone else in the room, the fact that she was clearly the bride at her own wedding reception. The cognitive dissonance was written all over his expression. My father, meanwhile, seemed oblivious to the growing silence. He took another sip of his wine, savoring both the vintage and the attention, and continued his performance for the captive audience of aging warriors who remembered when the world made more sense, when lines were clearer, when everyone knew their place, when daughters stayed home and sons went to war. "You see," he said, his voice carrying easily across the marble floor, "this is what happens when we lower standards to make everyone feel included. Pretty soon you've got people wearing uniforms they haven't earned, carrying ranks they don't deserve." He gestured vaguely in my direction without actually looking at me. "It's all for show, all politics, nothing real about it." The sergeant major with the prosthetic leg shifted uncomfortably, his eyes finding mine across the room. There was something like apology in his expression, or maybe recognition. He'd probably served with women, probably knew what it took to earn respect in a world that measured worth by how well you could perform under impossible conditions. But he didn't speak up. None of them did. Because challenging Colonel Blackwell would mean risking their place in the informal hierarchy that still governed their lives decades after they'd hung up their uniforms. That's when I felt David move. Not dramatically, not with any visible anger or aggression, but with the kind of purposeful motion that comes from absolute certainty about what needs to happen next. He stepped around me, placing himself between my father and the rest of the room, his posture military straight but relaxed. The stance of a man who'd made a decision and was prepared to see it through regardless of consequences. My father finally noticed him then, probably because David's movement had disrupted the sight lines he'd been using to gesture at me while avoiding direct eye contact. Their eyes met across 15 feet of marble floor and crystal chandeliers, 2 men in uniform who'd served their country in different wars, but under the same flag. For a moment I thought my father might recognize something in David's expression that would make him reconsider his words, maybe find a way to gracefully retreat from the precipice he'd created. Instead, he doubled down. "Of course, her husband here probably doesn't know any better," my father continued, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he'd perfected over decades of explaining the world to people he considered inferior. "Young officers today, they don't understand how things used to work. When merit actually meant something. When promotions were earned instead of handed out like participation trophies." The insult expanded like a shockwave, encompassing not just me but David, our marriage, our service, our entire generation of military personnel who'd fought wars my father couldn't imagine in places he'd never been. It was masterful in its cruelty, surgical in its precision. He'd managed to diminish everyone in the room under 35 while maintaining plausible deniability about what he really meant. David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His hands moved behind his back into the at ease position, a gesture so automatic that most civilians wouldn't have recognized its significance. But everyone in that room with military experience understood what they were seeing. A soldier preparing to engage, checking his weapon, ensuring his footing was solid before taking action. The silence stretched taut as piano wire. Someone's fork clinked against a plate. Ice shifted in a water glass. The small sounds of a formal dinner continued while everything important hung suspended in the space between my father's arrogance and whatever was about to happen next. I could have spoken up then, could have defended myself, defended David, defended every woman who'd ever worn the uniform while fighting battles that had nothing to do with enemy fire. Could have listed my deployments, my commendations, my record of service that spoke for itself to anyone willing to listen. Could have reminded my father that the army he was so nostalgic for wouldn't have existed without people like me holding it together behind the scenes. But I didn't. Not because I was afraid or ashamed or uncertain about my worth. I stayed quiet because I recognized something in David's posture, something in the way he was breathing, that told me this moment belonged to him. That he'd chosen to stand in this particular gap, and my job was to let him do it. The guests closest to us had gone completely still, sensing that they were about to witness something that would be remembered and retold for years afterward. The kind of moment that defines relationships, that draws lines in the sand that can never be erased. A few of the older officers near the far wall had turned toward us, drawn by some instinct that recognized the sound of approaching thunder even when the sky still looked clear. My father raised his wine glass again, preparing to deliver what he probably thought would be the killing blow. The final dismissal that would put me back in my place and restore the natural order he believed should govern the world. His mouth opened, lips shaping words that would have cut deeper than anything he'd already said. That's when David lifted his own glass, crystal catching the light like a raised sword, and spoke with the kind of clarity that cuts through noise and nonsense and cowardice like a blade through silk. The words that came out of his mouth changed everything. The words hit the room like artillery fire, clear, precise, devastating. "Sir, that trash is my commanding officer." David's voice carried the weight of absolute conviction, each syllable delivered with the kind of authority that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you stand for. No hesitation, no diplomacy, no attempt to soften the blow or find middle ground where none existed. My father's reaction was immediate and visceral. The wine he'd been savoring, the vintage he'd been using as a prop in his performance of superiority, erupted from his mouth in a crimson spray that painted his pristine dress shirt like a Jackson Pollock canvas. He choked, sputtered, his face cycling through shades of red that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with the shock of being challenged by someone he'd assumed would defer to his authority. The silence that followed wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a living thing, breathing and pulsing with the weight of truth finally spoken aloud. Every conversation in the room had died completely. The string quartet sat frozen, their instruments poised but silent. Even the wait staff had stopped moving, sensing that they were witnessing something that would be talked about in whispers for years to come. David didn't move from his position, didn't advance or retreat, didn't raise his voice or gesture dramatically. He simply stood there in his dress uniform, back straight, eyes level, radiating the kind of calm confidence that comes from knowing you've said exactly what needed to be said, in exactly the way it needed to be said. The champagne glass in his hand remained steady, a crystal exclamation point to punctuate his statement. My father fumbled for his napkin, dabbing at the wine stain spreading across his chest like spilled blood. His hands were shaking slightly, not from age or infirmity, but from the tremors that come when your worldview gets shattered in front of an audience. He kept glancing around the room, searching for allies, for someone to back up his position or at least laugh at his joke. But the laughter had died the moment David spoke. The sergeant major with the prosthetic leg was staring at David with something approaching awe. His weathered face had gone pale, but his eyes were bright with recognition. He'd probably served under officers like me, had seen what real leadership looked like when the bullets started flying and the easy answers ran out. He knew the difference between authority that demanded respect and authority that earned it through blood and sweat, and sleepless nights spent making decisions that kept other people alive. A young captain near the dessert table had gone completely rigid, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth as he processed what he'd just witnessed. He was probably running calculations in his head, trying to figure out the rank structure, the chain of command, the implications of what David had just revealed. The woman in dress blues wasn't just a bride playing dress-up in her husband's world. She was the commanding officer. The one who gave orders, made decisions, carried responsibility for the lives and welfare of the soldiers under her command. The cluster of older veterans who'd been hanging on my father's every word had scattered like leaves in a strong wind. Some had found sudden interest in their dinner plates. Others had developed an urgent need to visit the bar or check their phones or have whispered conversations with their spouses about whether it was time to leave. None of them wanted to be associated with what was rapidly becoming an embarrassing spectacle of ignorance and prejudice. My father finally found his voice, though it came out strangled and uncertain. "I don't understand," he said, the words barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning. "She's just..." He trailed off, his brain apparently unable to process the new information David had provided. The cognitive dissonance was written across his face in lines of confusion and dawning horror. "She's a lieutenant colonel," David continued, his voice still calm but now carrying an edge that could cut glass. "United States Army, combat veteran, 3 deployments, currently commanding the 247th Logistics Battalion at Fort Carson, approximately 800 soldiers under her direct authority." He paused, letting each fact land like a physical blow. "Sir." The final word hung in the air like the echo of a gunshot, respectful in form but devastating in substance, acknowledging my father's rank while simultaneously stripping away every assumption he'd built his insult upon. It was a masterclass in military courtesy used as a weapon, tradition turned against itself to expose the hollowness at its core. I watched my father's face cycle through a series of emotions too complex for any single expression to contain. Confusion gave way to disbelief, which transformed into something that might have been shame if he'd possessed the capacity for genuine self-reflection. But mostly what I saw was anger. Not the righteous anger of someone who'd been wronged, but the impotent fury of someone who'd been exposed as fundamentally wrong about something they'd built their identity around. The room began to move again, slowly, like people emerging from a bomb shelter after the all-clear had sounded. Conversations resumed in whispers. Glasses clinked with unusual delicacy. The string quartet found their rhythm again, though their music seemed somehow more tentative than before. Everyone was processing what they'd witnessed, trying to figure out how to react, what it meant, whether they should pretend it hadn't happened or address it directly. A Marine colonel from the far side of the room approached our table, his movements deliberate and purposeful. He was older than David and me, probably close to retirement, with the kind of bearing that came from decades of command responsibility. He stopped directly in front of me, came to attention with parade ground precision, and rendered a crisp salute. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly attentive room. "Thank you for your service." The salute hung there for a long moment, formal and unmistakable. I returned it with equal precision, the gesture automatic after years of training and tradition. But this wasn't just military courtesy. This was a statement, a declaration, a choosing of sides that everyone in the room understood. The colonel held his salute for exactly the regulation 3 seconds before dropping his hand and returning to his table without another word. Within moments, others began to follow his lead. Not dramatically, not in any coordinated fashion, but with the kind of organic respect that spreads through military communities when someone recognizes authentic leadership. A Navy commander nodded in my direction as he passed. An Air Force major raised her glass in a subtle toast. A retired sergeant major who'd been sitting quietly in the corner stood up and walked over to shake David's hand. "Good man," he said simply, gripping David's hand with the firmness that comes from calluses earned through decades of honest work. Takes backbone to do what's right when it's hard. My father watched this display of support with growing agitation. His face had gone from red to pale, to a sickly gray color that reminded me of concrete after rain. He kept opening and closing his mouth as if trying to find words that would restore his authority, reassert his position, explain away what had just happened. But there were no words that could accomplish that. The truth was out, acknowledged, accepted by everyone in the room who mattered. The young lieutenant, who'd been watching everything with wide eyes, finally worked up the courage to approach me directly. His hands were shaking slightly as he extended one toward me, and his voice cracked when he spoke. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say, if you don't mind me asking, what's it like, commanding a battalion?" The question was innocent enough, but it carried weight that went far beyond simple curiosity. He was asking what it felt like to carry responsibility for 800 lives, to make decisions that rippled down through the ranks and affected families he'd never meet, to wear authority that had been earned through performance rather than inherited through birth or bestowed through politics. I looked at this young officer, probably fresh out of college, still figuring out how to navigate the complex social dynamics of military life, and remembered what it had felt like to be in his position. Uncertain, eager to prove himself, looking for examples of what success could look like if he worked hard enough and stayed true to his principles. "It's like being responsible for 800 families," I said, my voice steady despite the emotional turbulence of the evening. "Every decision you make affects not just the soldier in front of you, but their spouse, their children, their parents. You carry that weight every day, and it never gets lighter. But it gets easier to bear when you remember that they're counting on you to be worthy of their trust." The lieutenant nodded solemnly, processing the information with the intensity of someone who understood he was receiving wisdom that couldn't be found in any manual or textbook. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Thank you, ma'am." As he walked away, I caught sight of my father again. He was still standing near the bar, but the crowd of admirers had completely dispersed. He looked smaller somehow, diminished not just by David's revelation but by the subsequent display of respect that had followed it. For decades, he'd built his identity around the assumption that his understanding of military life, military values, military hierarchy was complete and accurate. Tonight had shattered that assumption completely. The evening continued around us, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. What had started as a wedding reception celebrating the union of two people had transformed into something else entirely. A moment of reckoning, a redrawing of lines, a clarification of who stood where when it mattered. The guests who remained were those who understood what they'd witnessed and appreciated its significance. The others had quietly excused themselves, mumbling about early mornings and prior commitments. David moved closer to me, his presence solid and reassuring without being possessive or protective. He didn't need to shield me from my father's words or anyone else's judgment. That wasn't why he'd spoken up. He'd intervened because someone had told a lie in public, and lies left unchallenged have a way of becoming accepted truth. Someone needed to provide the facts, and he'd been in position to do so. "You didn't have to do that," I said quietly, though I was grateful beyond words that he had. He shook his head slightly, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah, I did. Not for you, but for them." He gestured subtly toward the young officers scattered throughout the room, the ones who were still forming their understanding of what leadership looked like, what respect meant, how authority should be wielded. They needed to see what it looks like when someone stands up for what's right instead of what's comfortable. I understood what he meant. The military was more than just an organization or a career path. It was a culture, a system of values, a way of understanding the world that got passed down from one generation to the next. Tonight, my father had tried to pass down a version of that culture that excluded people like me, that reduced complex human beings to simple categories based on accidents of birth rather than achievements of character. David had refused to let that version go unchallenged, not because he was my husband or because he loved me, though both of those things were true. He'd spoken up because he understood that silence in the face of injustice was complicity, that allowing false narratives to spread uncorrected was a betrayal of everything the uniform was supposed to represent. The string quartet had transitioned into something softer, more contemplative. People were beginning to drift toward the exits, the natural end of an evening that had already provided more drama than most formal events contained in their entirety. But there was a sense of completion in the air, of something important having been accomplished, even if it hadn't been planned. My father was gathering himself to leave, fumbling with his dress cap and avoiding eye contact with anyone who might want to continue the conversation David had started. His movements were stiff, mechanical, like a man going through motions he no longer understood. As he passed our table on his way to the door, he paused for just a moment. "I never knew," he said, the words barely audible. Not an apology, not an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. Then he was gone, disappearing into the Virginia night like smoke from an extinguished candle. The reception wound down gradually, naturally, with the kind of grace that comes when people understand they've been part of something significant. Handshakes and hugs, promises to stay in touch, invitations to visit when travel permitted. The normal rhythms of farewell, but infused with an undercurrent of shared experience that would bind these particular guests together in memory for years to come. As David and I prepared to leave, the Marine colonel who'd saluted me earlier approached one final time. He handed me a small card with his contact information and said, "If you ever need anything, ma'am, anything at all, there are more of us than you might think, and we remember who stands up when it matters." The drive back to our quarters was quiet, but not uncomfortable. We'd been through something together, weathered a storm that could have destroyed a weaker relationship. Instead, it had revealed the bedrock foundation upon which we'd built our partnership. Not romance or passion or shared interests, though all of those elements existed. What held us together was a deeper compatibility of values, a shared understanding of what mattered when everything else fell away. "Do you think he'll ever understand?" David asked as we pulled into our driveway. I considered the question seriously, thinking about my father's face when the truth had finally penetrated his armor of assumptions and prejudices. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but for the first time in my life, I don't need him to. Understanding would be nice, but it's not required. I know who I am and what I've accomplished. That's enough." And it was enough. For the first time in 37 years, my father's opinion of me felt like exactly what it had always been. Just one man's perspective, no more valid or important than anyone else's, certainly no more accurate than the evidence of my own life's work. The uniform I wore, the rank I'd earned, the soldiers I commanded, the missions I'd completed successfully. These things spoke for themselves to anyone willing to listen. The revelation hadn't been mine to make. I'd spent decades proving myself through action rather than words, building a reputation that could withstand any assault from ignorance or bias. David had simply provided the translation for those who needed it spelled out in terms they could understand. He'd taken my quiet competence and given it a voice that carried across the marble floors and crystal chandeliers to every corner of that reception hall. As we walked up the steps to our front door, I felt something I'd never experienced before in connection with my father, not anger or resentment or disappointment, but a kind of peaceful indifference. He could think whatever he wanted about me. He could tell whatever stories made him feel better about the world and his place in it. None of it would change the fundamental reality of who I was or what I'd accomplished. The wedding reception that had started as a celebration of new beginnings had become something else entirely. The final ending of an old story that had never served anyone well. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove myself worthy of the trust others placed in me. But tonight, for the first time in my adult life, I went to sleep knowing that the only approval I needed was my own. Own. That night marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The woman who had spent decades chasing approval that would never come finally stopped running. The father who had built his identity on outdated assumptions about strength and service discovered that the world had moved beyond his understanding while he wasn't paying attention. And the husband who chose truth over comfort reminded everyone in that marble-floored hall what real courage looks like when it wears dress blues. Years have passed since that reception, and the story has taken on a life of its own in military circles. Young officers tell it to each other during late-night conversations about leadership and respect. Veterans share it at reunions when someone starts talking about the good old days that weren't always as good as memory suggests. It's become a reminder that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought on foreign soil, but in the spaces between expectation and reality, between who we're told we should be and who we actually are. My father and I never had the reconciliation scene that movies promise. No tearful reunion, no moment of mutual understanding where past wounds heal through the magic of perfect dialogue. But we found something better than reconciliation. We found peace through distance, acceptance through indifference, freedom through the simple act of stopping the chase. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't winning someone over, it's realizing you never needed to. If you've ever been told you're not enough, if you've ever had someone try to reduce your accomplishments to accidents of politics or charity, if you've ever stood in uniform while someone questioned whether you earned the right to wear it, remember this. Your worth isn't determined by those who refuse to see it. Your service isn't diminished by those who can't understand it. Your strength isn't weakened by those who mistake it for weakness. The truth stands on its own. Sometimes it just needs someone brave enough to speak it aloud in a room full of people who need to hear it. And when that moment comes, when someone lifts their glass and says exactly what needs to be said, the silence that follows isn't empty. It's full of recognition, respect, and the sound of assumptions crashing to the marble floor like shattered crystal. That's the real victory, not the wine staining a dress shirt or the embarrassment of being corrected in public. The victory is in the young officers who witnessed truth being spoken to power. The victory is in the culture slowly changing, one moment of courage at a time. The victory is in knowing that respect, once earned, doesn't require anyone's permission to exist. So here's to the soldiers who serve quietly, the leaders who earn their authority through action rather than inherited assumption, and the partners who stand up when it matters most. Here's to the truth that cuts through pretense like a blade through silk, and to the silence that follows when everyone finally understands exactly who's been standing in front of them all along.